You may have heard about the security vulnerability in Apple's iMessage application that was discovered by Christina Garvin, Matthew Green, Gabriel Kapchuk, Ian Mears, and Michael Rushanen of Johns Hopkins. This video is going to explain how that vulnerability works at a very, very high level. First of all, the attack would allow the attacker to correctly guess the cryptographic keys that were used to decrypt attachments in Apple's iMessage. And specifically, it impacts the iMessage application for iOS versions before 9.3 and Mac OS X versions prior to 10.11. The attack is quite involved, but the core underlying concept is actually not that difficult. Normally, if you had to try guessing an entire cryptographic key, it would take an inordinate amount of time because there are an astronomically large number of possibilities. Instead, if you could guess a small piece at a time and be able to verify your guess, then it would be much faster. So here's a simple example that illuminates the main idea. Imagine I had no idea who you were and you asked me to guess your first name. If my only option was to try guessing your entire first name at once before you told me whether I was right or not, I'd probably need a lot of guesses before stumbling upon the right name. If, however, I could guess each letter in your name separately, and you told me whether I was right each step of the way, it would be a lot faster. For example, I can ask if the first letter of your name is an A, then B, and so on, until I guess right. And then once I get the first letter right, I can move on to the second letter, then the third letter, and so on until I'm done. It's much easier. The iMessage attack involves a similar idea. So, going into detail, you need to know at a high level how an iMessage with an attachment is transmitted. Imagine we have a person, Alice, who is looking to send an iMessage with an attachment to a person named Bob. And to keep things simple, let's assume that Alice is sending a digital picture to Bob, although the attack would work for other attachments like movies, for example. Behind the scenes, Alice's iPhone first generates a special sequence of numbers called a key that we're going to denote by the letter K. And Alice's iPhone will use this key K to perform what's known as symmetric encryption of that picture. And symmetric encryption is basically a mathematical transformation of a piece of data such that only knowledge of the key K lets you decrypt or extract the original data given the encrypted data. Alice's iPhone then sends this encrypted picture to the iCloud server, which I'll depict by drawing a box around the data with the letter K next to it. That's how I'll denote encryption. Then the iCloud server in turn returns back a bunch of information to Alice that includes a URL of the form http://icloud.com/ and a bunch of other characters. And this URL gives the location from which Bob's phone can download the encrypted picture. Next, Alice's iPhone will obtain a copy of Bob's public encryption key, and I'm going to call that key PK sub B. This key, this public key, will be used to help Alice encrypt data to Bob. And the idea is that if a public key encryption algorithm is implemented correctly, only Bob's phone will be able to decrypt that encrypted data, since only Bob's phone will know the private decryption key corresponding to his public encryption key. Alice's iPhone will then take this iCloud URL that it was given, as well as the key K that was used to encrypt the picture, together with some additional information, and she basically encrypts all of this data leveraging Bob's public encryption key. And I'll depict that by drawing a box around all this data, together with the name of the key, PK sub B. Alice's phone will also compute what's known as a digital signature on this encrypted data. And I'll depict that digital signature by appending the letters sig sub A. So the resulting encrypted data and the signature is sent to Bob. I won't go into detail regarding what a digital signature is, but it's basically a series of numbers that act as the analog of a regular physical signature, but in the digital realm. Bob's iPhone, in turn, executes a series of steps to validate Alice's digital signature. Next, Bob's iPhone will use its knowledge of Bob's private decryption key to decrypt the data Alice sent to him. Bob's iPhone will in turn obtain the URL where the encrypted image is located and the key K that was used to encrypt that image. And if the results look appropriately formed, then Bob's phone will go ahead and retrieve the encrypted image from that iCloud URL. It'll download that image, and then Bob's iPhone will decrypt that image using the key K. The result of all of these steps is that Alice will have successfully transmitted a message containing an attachment to Bob. And because cryptographic tools like encryption and digital signing were used, only Alice and Bob should ostensibly be able to determine the contents of that communication. Now that we've seen how an iMessage is sent, let's see where things can go wrong. If you think about it, encryption provides confidentiality of data, and digital signing provides authentication. Authentication is about ensuring that the data was sent without modification by the person who claims to have sent it. Even though both confidentiality and authentication are present here in iMessage, the core flaw is that they are somewhat loosely coupled rather than being inextricably tied. So here's what the attacker could do. First, the attacker has to get a copy of the encrypted data that Alice sent to Bob. And that could, for example, be done through a subpoena or maybe through a rogue insider employee or something along those lines. It's not easy to do, but certainly not entirely impossible either. Second, the attacker would strip out the digital signature on the message, just remove it. Third, the attacker would make some minor modifications to the encrypted data that essentially amount to an attempt to guess a very small portion of the key used to encrypt that data. The attacker would also make some minor modifications to the encrypted text that amount to changing the domain name iCloud in the URL to something that goes to a different domain, like i8loud.com instead of iCloud.com, with the idea being that the attacker can, ahead of time, set up a computer, a server, located at i8loud.com that it controls. Finally, the attacker would digitally sign the data himself using an account associated with an @i8loud.com email address, and then it would go ahead and send everything to Bob's iPhone. Now, when Bob's iPhone receives all this data, it's going to go through the usual steps. It'll validate a signature, it'll decrypt, etc. But most of the time, the result's going to be gibberish. After all, the whole point of encrypting data is to make it difficult to simply modify the data in a meaningful way and get something meaningful when you decrypt it. Because typically when you modify encrypted data, it won't decrypt into anything that makes sense. However, once in a while, and this is precisely because of how Apple iMessage does encryption, once in a while, those minor modifications, if done appropriately, would result in something that actually does not decrypt to gibberish, and in fact would occasionally become well-formed. And if it's the case that the result of the decryption is well-formed, Bob's iPhone will think everything is okay, and Bob's iPhone will then attempt to retrieve the image. However, it's going to think that the image is located at i8loud.com. Now at this point, the attacker, because it's controlling i8loud.com, will know that that small piece of the encryption key that it tried to guess earlier was correct. And it's going to know that by virtue of the fact that Bob tried to communicate with i8loud.com. the attacker owns that server, it can monitor that somebody tried to communicate with it. And so the attacker will essentially get knowledge or verification of the knowledge of a small portion of that encryption key. And by repeating that process that I just described multiple times, the attacker can actually learn the entire key in this manner. So the main concept here is that because of the way that encryption is performed in iMessage, and because of the fact that the digital signature can be stripped and replaced, the attacker can try guessing a small portion of the key. And more so, the attacker can ascertain whether that guess it made was correct, because whenever the guess is correct, Bob's iPhone will communicate with i8loud.com, which is controlled by the attacker. Now normally, if encryption and authentication are done correctly, the attacker would have to resort to guessing the entire key K at once. And that's impractical because there are, as I mentioned earlier, an astronomically large number of possibilities. If, however, the attacker can guess just a small piece of the key at a time and verify that guess, then the attacker can learn the key a lot faster. So that's the key concept behind the attack. But please note that the attack itself is a lot more involved, and there are many, many complex details that I have left out. So I want to make a few quick comments before I end the video. First of all, this attack is resource intensive. In fact, in some of the prototype tests done by the Johns Hopkins research team, the attacker would need over 250,000 tries before succeeding, and that process could take up to 70 hours. Of course, there are some improvements that they can try, but suffice it to say the attack is certainly involved. Second, the attack requires having access to the encrypted messages that Alice sent to Bob, and that's not a realistic assumption by any stretch. Third of all, every single one of the underlying cryptographic algorithms used here are actually considered to be secure in isolation. And this is an important point, because the flaw arises from the incorrect combination and applications of those algorithms. In other words, cryptography is hard. Even experts get things wrong frequently. And I bring this up because there's been a lot of discussion about backdoors in cryptographic systems. A backdoor just adds a whole new level of complexity. If it's hard to implement even basic crypto correctly, can you imagine what happens when backdoors are thrown into the mix? Finally, don't panic. This attack is really hard to mount, but that said, it's not impossible either, especially for a highly motivated attacker with significant funding, but it is still very hard. But beyond that, any attack that demonstrates an unintended deviation from prescribed functionality of a system should be addressed swiftly and expeditiously. And of course, there's an old adage that says that attacks only get better over time, they never get worse. The good news, though, in this case, is that Apple has already made fixes to thwart this attack. I know it was quite a long video, but hopefully you've come away with a better understanding of this attack on iMessage.